25 million of us work in Britain. All of us face a crisis. Tonight we have just 6 workers in the studio, and they are all agreed on at least one thing, that they or others among them are worth more. Well, how much do we think we're all worth? That's an economic question. It's also a moral one. In tonight's Panorama on Pay, we'll be hearing from our 6 workers, from a trade union leader who is a strong champion of free collective bargaining, from another union leader who is an equally strong champion of free collective bargaining but who has settled under Stage 3, and from the politicians who have their ideas on an early election, on how we should decide who gets what, and indeed on how much each of us should pay in tax. We also have an exclusive interview with a man who earns £27,500 a year, and who, if all goes well or ill for him, may get a job worth £126,000 a year, the Vice President of the United States, Gerald Ford. First, the question of pay, a serious problem, one that underlies the crisis the country finds itself in today. Questions of who's worth more than whom, and who should come where in the pecking order, lie at the heart of the political debate about regulating pay. Today, crucial talks were held between the government and the TUC, which could determine whether Mr. Heath calls an election now or not. Should the government accept the proposal that if the miners are offered more, other unions wouldn't use this as an argument to support their own wage demands and thus leapfrog up the wages ladder?
Well, the talks at Downing Street have been going on now for several hours, but whatever the outcome of those talks, and whether there's a crisis election or not, should the TUC offer be seen as a first step by the TUC towards some new way of settling people's pay in the future, some system of working out which job is worth more than another job and by how much and why. Is there any hope of such a system intended to be fair for all instead of free for all?
The government's idea of a fair for all is Stage 3, which is under challenge from the miners. The miners are claiming that they're not paid enough. More than that, they're claiming that they're not paid enough relative to other people, that they're not where they should be in the pay league. Well, is that a complaint peculiar to the miners and the railmen, or do other workers feel the same? Well, earlier today, we asked our 6 workers, ranging from the highest paid, our merchant banker, to the lowest, our postman, in what order they think their 6 jobs should be ranked for payment. As you might expect, they gave us very different answers. But more important perhaps, not one of them thought the existing order was totally fair. The merchant banker downgraded the car worker, and the businessman downgraded the postman, but both of them put themselves in positions 1 and 2 on the list. Mr. Baldwin, why do you think you're worth more than anybody else on the list?
I think I should explain what a merchant banker does, because very few people know. A merchant banker is engaged in providing finance for industry and trade. Without finance for industry and trade, it stops working. It's like the lubrication in the machinery. I don't produce, but without me, very little can be produced. I believe that remuneration is based not on the moral considerations of who is working hard or who is not working hard, but on the straight economics. What does it cost to get competent people to do the various jobs? And on that criteria, I think that myself, I'm entitled to the highest remuneration of the people who are gathered here today.
Mr. Balson, as a businessman, do you go along with that?
I feel that any income policy that's going to work must cater for differentials. And I think it must also cater for efficiency. I feel that management today has got a difficult job and has got to be rewarded. The reason I place the nurse at the bottom of the list is that I couldn't find it possible to place this devoted worker into any category whatsoever. I feel quite strongly that the first 3 years of a nurse's life, she is very, very much underpaid.
Well, our car worker didn't agree with those 2 orders. He put the merchant banker down at the bottom and the nurse and the miner up at the top. The miner's order was similar, though he put the businessman down at the bottom with the merchant banker. And there's an interesting question there, Mr. Lane. You don't believe in paying people more for managerial and financial responsibility than paying ordinary workers.
Well, for what the merchant banker said about it's not anything to do with morals, if our society, the way we pay people, isn't to do any with morals at all, then we get the chaos and mess that we seem to be in today. Unless we can attach some sort of morality to the way we reward people for what they do in society, then we are in trouble, and we are in trouble now. I put the nurse at the top because I always hope that our society will at some time be governed by people with altruistic motives, and I think that that order would probably be the order if we were governed by such a government.
Mr. Tyson, you believe that you are a special case.
Yes, I do believe I'm a special case, for the simple reason we've got a world energy shortage, and where there's a demand for a commodity, you must pay the price towards it. The law of supply and demand dictates that. When they didn't want the miner, they were quite willing to make him redundant and run him up and down the country looking after work. But now a miner knows what he's worth, he's going to stick until he gets what he's worth.
But today, you would pay yourself more than you would pay a mine manager.
The reason why I suggested that is because, like the merchant banker and the businessman here, they're far overrated. I mean, who deserves 15,000 and who deserves, like a miner, £36.79 for working on the face? The levels between both wages are far out of reach.
Now, both of you, in fact, put the miner above the car worker. And so, Mr. Lane, if Mr. Tyson were to succeed in being a special case, would you still feel that you had to keep your pay claim in to stay where you are?
In the present climate where we are governed, again I say where we are governed by a Conservative government pledged to free enterprise and the jungle, as I call that, I would find it necessary to keep my claws as sharp as anyone else's in that society, and I might for that reason say that I should get as much as the miner. However, his job being as it is, if we had a government that was pledged to something more altruistically motivated in governing people, then I would say probably the miner would get more because of the nature of his work.
And our nurse was also sympathetic to the miner, but put herself at the top and the car worker at the bottom. Our postman was more conventional, but he too put the car worker down at the bottom. Do you think that some workers are in fact overpaid, and is that because you feel, Sister Farrington, you feel underpaid?
I certainly feel underpaid, yes. I put the car worker at the bottom because I look at the cars as a luxury, and I don't see why everybody here has said that the nurse should be paid more. I don't see why I should be paid less for an essential service than somebody providing a luxury.
Mr. Dorman, why did you make your choice?
I put the merchant banker at the top because I think a merchant banker is an essential. He's a must if we're going to get anything out of industry or a private industry. Need to be borrowed off somebody, it's got to be the merchant banker. The car worker, I put him at the bottom because I think you've overlooked the fact that people who give a service aren't getting enough. I'm in agreement with the nurse. People who give a service are very, very lowly paid.
Thank you very much. And so disagreement here, apparently continuing disagreement at number 10 Downing Street. Where can or should there be agreement? In a letter to the Times today, Professor Elliot Jacks of Brunel University suggested that the TUC's idea that if the miners were a special case, other unions which would then say that they wouldn't use that as an argument for their own pay claims. Well, that suggestion, he said, might be just pure eyewash until it was tested, or it might be one of the most far-reaching and forward-looking political acts of recent times. Now, under what terms could it be far-reaching and forward-looking?
Well, the point I made was that if it was simply an agreement not to use that particular argument for advancing other unions' claims in favor of their demands for special treatment, then one could understand it as an act calculated to get public sympathy, a public relations act, but I think not much more substance than that. On the other hand, if the TUC General Council were now willing to agree that the miners should be treated as a special case in the sense of coming up differentially, relatively, as compared with other union members, say, for example, that it would be agreed that they should come to the top of the league table, then this would be a tremendous step forward, because what you would have would be representatives of the trade unions in this country agreeing to the relative positions as between members, at least taking a start in that direction. And somewhere along the way, I think for these problems to be resolved and settled fundamentally for all time, in effect, to get a real solution for the nation, it is going to mean that elected representatives of eventually all 23 million of the wage and salary workers in this country are going to have to agree on pecking order on where they ought to be relative to each other. You've heard the discussion among the members of the panel. There are very strong views on this. This is what people really feel strongly about.
But it wouldn't be a permanent pecking order. It'd be one we would have to change.
Well, I think this is the point, that what would be required, what is required, and their proposals for achieving this, is the development of institutions in which differentials, in which pecking order could be kept constantly and consistently under review, under conditions where you could get consensus among the representatives of the people. This really must grow up at grassroots. That automatic job evaluation and so on won't do it. Job evaluation methods might help, but eventually along the way there is going to have to be consensus among elected representatives of all of the people in this country.
Thank you, Professor Jackson.
Well, whatever the outcome of the TUC offer in the present crisis, the problem of how one man's pay should be related to another's is one which both the Conservative government and the Labour opposition are much concerned. The government has commissioned a report, expected shortly from the Pay Board, on the whole complex question of the relativity of pay, as it's called. And the Labour Party, in its new campaign policy document, proposes a royal commission to advise on income distribution, wage differentials and job evaluation. With me first are two trade union leaders, Harry Owen, Deputy General Secretary of the Giant Transport and General Workers Union, and Alan Fisher of the Public Employees Union, which includes such lower paid workers such as nurses, dustmen and street sweepers. Mr. Fisher, bearing in mind what Professor Jacks has been talking about, do you think that there should be some kind of planned wages policy to achieve what we might call fairness in pay as between one job and another, or is free collective bargaining the only way?
I think there's perhaps we might call it a dichotomy of thinking there. I don't think that free collective bargaining, if we use that phrase, rather than a free-for-all, which I think is a very different thing, necessarily rules out some form of planned incomes policy. My view is that we ought to be able to do this job much better than we've done it in the past. I think the very way in which pay, incomes of all kinds, and let's be clear about this, incomes are not only those incomes that are earned, and it may well be that our panel tonight are all people who earn their incomes. It's also unearned income, income that comes from rent, income that comes from profits and holding of shares and so on, for which people may do nothing at all. But if we could have, and I'm sure we could in this country, a much fairer distribution of incomes, I think two things are necessary to begin with. First, we must have a government that is prepared to follow social policies that are patently just, that people will see that the government's policies in taxation, in prices, in rent control and so on are designed to give a much fairer distribution of incomes. That's number one. And secondly, taking it is going to be a voluntary policy. It's only the unions themselves in the end who will be able to devise a voluntary policy where they will be able to agree on the priorities to be afforded to workers at any time.
Before I come to Mr. Irving, can I just ask you this? Do you have any faith in the ability of the trade unions, as you've just suggested, to work together to ensure, for instance, that your members will not get a raw deal?
Yes, I have. I think in the long term that this is possible. I think the very pressure of events at the moment is forcing the unions to rethink their strategy in this area.
You didn't get much support, for instance, from Mr. Harry Owen here and other union leaders in your demand for a statutory minimum wage so as to help your people.
Well, that's just
one. At the Labour Party
that's just one form of trying to do something. Let the government come in and let's start off by saying it's a statutory minimum wage. I think the difference between Harry Irwin's union and mine was they took it that it should be a voluntary minimum.
Well, let's ask him what he thinks. Can I, Mr. Fisher?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. What do you think of this idea, of the general idea of working towards a planned wages policy?
I believe that if you're living in a free enterprise society where it's accepted that the profit motive is essential to get production and keep people moving, then free collective bargaining is the best system of fixing wages and conditions of employment. That doesn't mean that it's a perfect system by any means, any more than the so-called free enterprise system is a perfect system. But it's the best that you can devise within that general economic framework. That doesn't mean that you can't have discussions at national level between governments and employers' organisations and the like to see where we're moving, in which direction we're going, to ensure that generally incomes in society are moving into a more fair pattern than heretofore. But one thing I want to sort of stress is very often when people are talking about incomes policies, they're talking about the people at the bottom end of the scale, the difference between the plumber and his mate. We don't want to see the people in this country divided into plebs and proles, like George Orwell suggested in 1984, and the proles have their wages state-controlled, and the plebs go free to rake in the sort of payments of any kind.
Do you, Mr. Irwin, see any system which you can foresee under which your union would surrender what you regard as the right of free collective bargaining in order to help the interests of other, less powerful workers?
You see, we as a union with 1.8 million members have interests in a whole range of different industries. We've got low-paid members and high-paid members. And when our conference comes together, they're constantly looking as to how their lower-paid members can be helped by the others. But you have to examine the position in each industry. You have to examine the conditions in the car industry as well as the conditions in the mining and other industries and why people are paid these sort of wages.
Briefly, gentlemen, do you think there's any use in inquiries into all this business of pay relativity and what job evaluation and so forth, either by the pay board or the Labour Party's proposed advisory royal commission?
Yes, I think there's a value in the work that goes on as a background, but it should never be seen as an end in itself. Job evaluation is a technique, it's a tool. It ought to be used by those people who are involved overall in the bargaining process. It isn't the total answer. But I certainly think that the reports that we've had on low pay, for one example, have been useful. They have tried to point the way. I hope something comes out of the pay board report on relativities. I'm not too hopeful. I think the idea of a royal commission, some sort of statutory body, this depends who's on the statutory body. It depends how it's constituted. It's something we would have to look at, I think, very closely on the trade union side to see how we might make progress. Something ought to be done. I think we're making a rotten job of it now, and we ought to do something better. And if those bodies will help to do that, fine.
May I put you what Enoch Powell said the other day, that it's a delusion to imagine there's any mechanism which could tell us what ought to be the relative remuneration of a mine worker or a trawlerman or all the rest. He said no such mechanisms exist or can possibly be contrived. It is beyond human imagination. You would probably agree with that, wouldn't you, Mr. Irwin?
No, I don't agree entirely with... I can remember the time when Enoch Powell was arguing exactly the opposite. So that I'm not very impressed with Enoch Powell's arguments, be they on this or race or anything else. What I'm saying is that we do live in a free enterprise capitalist society which says that people have to have incentives and rewards if they're to do their best. And you can't apply that to the merchant bankers and the finance houses and the industrialists and all the others without applying this to ordinary working people.
Thank you, Mr. Irwin. And now, after those two trade union leaders, I turn to two members of Parliament. Mrs. Barbara Castle, who, as a former Secretary of State for Employment, knows the difficulties of getting any incomes policy to work, and a Conservative backbencher, Mr. Angus Maud. Mrs. Castle, whatever may be the outcome of this present crisis, do you think there can be some kind of new pay policy which could get away from both the jungle of free collective bargaining and from the battlegrounds which can be created by a statutory policy?
I agree with Alan on this. I think it's quite wrong for us to equate free collective bargaining with a free-for-all. I think we've all got well beyond that stage, and we've all been learning in recent years. There's no doubt about that. And of course we have to find a way in which we can combine the flexibility of the free collective bargaining system with criteria of social justice which satisfy the human urge in all of us. Now, I found it absolutely fascinating to listen to our panel on their mutual job evaluation. And I couldn't help feeling this is the hopeful way forward. Let us all get as free men and women without some statutory compulsion imposed on us from on high. Let us get talking about each other's relative values to society. And Robin, I must say that from my experience of trying to operate a statutory prices and incomes policy, and I've always been theoretically in favour of it because I've been in favour of the planned growth of wages as part of the economic planning of society. But having to operate it, I had to realise the absurd extremes to which I was driven by the very rigidity of my own statutory framework. It isn't easy. You've got to find a combination between the two. But may I just conclude by saying this? What was significant in the panel's discussion was that there was a merchant banker and a businessman included. And as our trade union friends have said, this has always been lacking from any previous incomes policy. And until their value to society is also included in the assessment, it won't work, whether it's voluntary, statutory, or anything else. And our proposed Royal Commission on income distribution, which was an idea of Jack Jones's incidentally, would go out of its way to be concerned with unearned income as well as earned income.
It would only be advisory, though. It would have no power.
Oh, certainly, but look, it would, for instance, reveal to society this fact. We have at the moment, we've got the miners being pilloried as the cause of inflation. And the Minister of Energy himself, Lord Carrington, is reported as currently negotiating the sale of 150 acres of his own land at a price that'll bring in £10 million on which homes are going to be built. Now, I'm sorry, I would never be a party to trying to operate ever again a statutory incomes policy in a context in which you allow that kind of gross maldistribution of income to take place.
If I may interrupt, Mrs. Gospel, I think it's Angus Maud's turn to give his view on this problem.
Well, I agree with the first part of what Barbara Castle said. I think that unless we get towards some kind of a voluntary incomes policy, there is no hope for us at all. I believe that in the present crisis, we have to have a statutory incomes policy, and I believe it is while the ground is held by the statutory incomes policy that we can, by agreement with luck, work ourselves towards some kind of voluntary policy. But there are three things, aren't there, which confuse the issue. The first is the question of relativities, the traditional relativities. See, I was interested to find that not one of your 6 people here is a farm worker, for example, and as a countryman, I'm interested in the farm worker who is, we're now producing 70% of our own food. The farm worker has always been right down the bottom of the ladder and used as an excuse by many unions in the past. When he gets a rise, everyone else has to have a rise. Yet the farm worker has now become one of the most skilled workers in the country, and his productivity has risen since the beginning of the war more than almost anyone else's in industry. But he's way down at the bottom. Now, the second thing is the intervention of the government, because the government is either the employer or the person who finances the employers of such an enormous number of people now. And it is, you will always find under a Labour or a Conservative government that the Treasury will always argue about increases for workers, not only in the nationalised industry, but for school teachers, nurses, anywhere where the money in the last resort comes from the government. And the third thing, of course, is the power of certain unions to force their claims on the public by putting the public to very great inconvenience. Now, I have the greatest sympathy with the postmen, who are now thoroughly undermanned. The postal service is deteriorating. They tried a strike, and it didn't do them all that much good because they were found to be not as essential as the miners are now. But we really cannot go on indefinitely with these trials of strength. Sooner or later, before we relax the statutory policy, we have got to get an agreed system by which, without a leapfrogging free-for-all, we can have some kind of gradual increases. Anybody who tries to say what workers will be scarcest in 5 years' time is always going to be wrong.
Now, could I ask one question to both of you? Do either of you, a great deal between you on that, actually. But can either of you see any way of achieving, any practical way of achieving a fairness between one worker's pay and another, without which no incomes policy, whether voluntary or statutory, is going to last for long? Barbara?
Well, I think it's got to be done by the agreed job assessment of themselves by the workers themselves. I simply don't believe it can be imposed rigidly from outside. Now, you can have investigations and inquiries, such as we are proposing through our Standing Royal Commission. These are very important because they tell us what the situation really is, and there are a lot of myths about the situation. But when it comes to applying those lessons in practice, we have become convinced in the Labour Party, as a result of my experience, if you like, that it has got to be handed to the tactical body which is self-governing, and we are proposing a conciliation and arbitration service which is non-governmental, which is manned by trade unions, employers and industrial relations experts.
Angus Maud, your practical solution?
Yeah, I wouldn't say out of hand that wouldn't work, though the idea that it can be decided by workers themselves, look at these 6 lady and gentlemen. Each of them put one at the top, another at the bottom, and then another one reversed it. Nobody is ever going to agree that their remuneration is fair compared with another. You're always going to have struggle and strife about it, surely. But I would agree that there is room for some advisory body which can try and get the relativities right, but I would say that it must never be for longer than 1 or 2 years, because
Angus, you'll be coming back again, I think, in response to our 6 people. Alistair?
Yes, let's try some of these ideas out now. I think first, Mr. Lane, the car worker, do you have any confidence in the Trade Union Congress's ability to control things if such a system were set up?
Well, I think that possibly, if the atmosphere were changed completely. I was interested to hear Angus Maud say he'd like to see a farmer on this panel, and Barbara Castle said she was glad to see a merchant banker and a businessman. What I'd like to see on a panel are people who shift millions of pounds around, such as the run on the pound last week when somebody decided that the oil crisis wasn't going to affect America. So millions of pounds were sold and millions of dollars bought. So
can I take from that you don't have much confidence in the TUC's ability to control things?
In the present situation where we live in this society it's dog eat dog, no, because they're going to fight for their own.
Now, Mr. Dorman, as postman, what about the point which was raised earlier? Do you think that the big and powerful unions would hold back to help weaker unions?
I don't think so. I'm feared of one thing, that somewhere in the TUC there's got to be something brought up that says, look after the smaller unions, because the larger unions have got bigger bargaining powers, like the amalgamated unions. They can hold the country to ransom. The smaller unions, like the Union of Post Office Workers, who only give a service to the country, we have to pick up the crumbs. I'm afraid sometimes, as I get the opinion that it's in the larger unions we've got anything you can do, I can do better. But where does this leave the poor old postman? Way down at the bottom. The man who gives a service, like a nurse gives a service, these are left way, way down.
Well, now, Mr. Baldwin, our merchant banker, Barbara Castle raised the question of social justice. Do you have an answer to her?
No, I think there's one tendency which is common amongst a lot of people when talking about remuneration, to think that that is too much as a kind of abstract concept. One has got to think whether or not we get value for money. For example, I could do my job just as well as a section head in the Ministry of Planning for probably half the salary. But I would really wonder whether our capital investment decisions would, in the end, be cheaper made by such a vehicle. We must be very careful indeed, therefore, to say that is just too much in an abstract sense.
Now, Mr. Tyson, as a miner, you heard Mr. Enoch Powell quoted just now, saying that no mechanism existed for deciding between people on moral grounds. Do you agree with that?
Well, we in the mining industry, we've been hit that hard over the last 15 years through closures and shut down, that people like the miners and the trawlermen are in a very peculiar position. For in one sense they're up and in another sense they're down. And when the country needs miners, they don't want to know about them. They think they just pass anything over upon them. And I'm afraid today it's far gone past the point where a miner's just going to sit back and let somebody else dictate his rights to them.
Mr. Farrington, Angus Maud raised the question about the inconvenience to the public that strikes and go-slows cause. Do you agree with him?
I think it's a great pity that it comes to the fact that you have to withdraw your labour. People like ambulance men. No ambulance man downs tools without a very good reason. Nobody in an essential service would simply withdraw that essential service without a very good reason.
Mr. Mawson, how do you feel this as a businessman? Would you like to take up any of the points made by our two trade union colleagues?
Yes, I'm a born optimist, and I think it's great to see Mrs. Castle and the three men present today even agreeing on certain, subjects. I feel what's been sadly lacking, and I feel that credibility of leadership throughout the world has never been at its lowest ebb. I hope that the present crisis has brought us to our feet, that we see common sense, and common sense has been talked today, and I feel that every one of us can contribute to ending this crisis and going forward to making Britain great again.
And it's this crisis I have to interrupt, if Alistair will excuse me, because we have to go over to number 10, where the talks at Downing Street have ended, and we go to an interview with Alan Watson.
Mr. Murray, can you tell me in fact what's happened in the meeting?
Yes, the one fact is that we've been very deeply disappointed. We've tried very hard today to get the government to accept the TUC's peace formula for getting Britain back to work. But so far, at least, we seem to have failed, so far anyway.
What sort of guarantees was the government, in fact, asking you for?
Well, the government was was probing around in what we'd said. We said that no other union would use this as an argument in their own wage negotiations, and we said that this, we were sure, would be unanimously endorsed by a special conference of presidents and general secretaries of all our unions as being called on Wednesday. And they appear to be reasonably satisfied with that, although they know it can't be copper-bottomed. They know that if we say a thing like that, then we mean it and we can make it stick.
But do you think they will accept that as what they're in fact asking for?
Well, the government so far isn't accepting the formula as a whole, I'm very sorry to say. They still seem to be uneasy. They still seem to have some sort of apprehensions. I don't know why, because this is the one thing which is being offered, which will get Britain's industry working again, and there's nothing else on offer now, and why the government can't accept this and work with us to get Britain back to work, I just do not know.
Well, that was Len Murray a few minutes ago talking on these talks. It's not quite clear whether they're going to be resumed again, but the essence of it was that he thought, at any rate, that they had failed. We've only had one side of it. What's your reaction to that, Angus Maud?
Well, I hope that it isn't the end of the talks, and I don't think I got the impression from Mr. Murray that it was. It rather sounded to me as if they were going to be resumed again. But I can see, of course, what the government's worry is, that to say that no union will use the miners' precedent as an argument doesn't prevent them from going on pressing their claims on other grounds. And when Mr. Hugh Scanlon says that he will settle within Phase 3, of course, what he means is that he'll settle nationally within Phase 3, but he hopes that his factories will all get second deals inside Phase 3, so he gets it twice. I can see that the government does want a little more guarantee than this.
What do you think they want? What do you think they more want, which the trade unions can give, remembering President Kennedy's motto that you should always negotiate so as to let your opponent get off his hook?
Well, I think what the government would ask for now, quite reasonably in my view, is to say that if they do a deal with the miners now outside Phase 3, that every other union will agree not to press a claim beyond Phase 3 so long as Phase 3 lasts.
Let's see if Harry Irwin, who is not at the talks, but he's close touch with his General Secretary, Jack Jones. What do you think about that proposal and what Len Murray said?
My view is that the TUC have gone farther on this issue than any issue that I can remember. And the intention is to try to get a settlement of the miners' dispute so that people can get back to work as quickly as possible. That's the intention, no other intention. No Union General Secretary can say absolutely, categorically, that no one will settle inside or outside. But my own union, for example, has settled hundreds of claims at the present time within Phase 3 for very militant sections of workers. That we didn't instruct them to settle within Phase 3. We said deal with the case on its merits. And in each case, they've settled the case on its merits within Stage 3.
But Angus Moore's point is that the government want to avoid what happened after Wilberforce, namely, as the government says, a flood of wage claims trying to get back to and erode the miners' advance.
This isn't true, you see. All the evidence is that after Wilberforce, the level of claims went down, in fact. There is no evidence at all which shows that the floodgates would be opened.
But the average percentage rise went up after Wilberforce.
If after this initiative, and what the TUC has said publicly, the floodgates was to be opened and everybody was in, then the TUC standing wouldn't be any high for talks with any government in the future.
May I put one final question?
So that they're putting a great deal on this.
May I put one final question to you all? Do you think that a general election on this general issue would be good for the country? Barbara Castle, now.
Of course not, particularly as all the government is seeking to do is to justify a 3-day week, which is unjustifiable. The government has a solution to the miners' problem within its hands in the relativities report of the pay board, which will be available in a day or two's time, and which was specifically designed to make Stage 3 more flexible in special cases. If the government doesn't use that, then we shall all know that it merely wants to exacerbate class war in this country.
Alan Fisher?
Well, I think that this is a clear indication that the government itself is trying to, in this situation, steer towards a general election. I think it's unfortunate. I don't think it will solve any of the problems if we have a general election on this issue. Who runs the nation, the government or the trade unions? I can't see that that solves anything at all. But since they seem to be unwilling to pick up what I think is a very real and a very serious initiative put forward by the TUC, one can only conclude that the government wants to get out of its political failures by putting the blame onto the miners and putting the blame onto the trade union movement in this country.
Angus Moore, what do you think of a general election in which the Conservatives would have to answer a slogan, according to Mr Jim Callaghan now, of back to work with Labour at a time when there is increasing unemployment and disruption from the 3-day week?
Well, if a Labour government tried to get Britain off a 3-day week in present circumstances, they would soon find themselves in trouble, because even the loss of coal production and the oil problems we've had already mean that we couldn't keep essential services going beyond about the middle of March. There is no question at all that this government wants an election. The last man in the world to run away from a job he's undertaken is Ted Heath. He wants a settlement.
Britain to the United States, it looked as though Vice President Ford was a man who could leapfrog straight into the White House. But so far, Mr. Nixon has survived, and many Americans still feel, however, that there are pressures which could prevent him from completing his second term. New Year poll showed that 50% of Americans would like the chance to vote for a new president in a by-election this year. And so Mr. Ford is very much in the front line of a continuing crisis and of the administration's attempts to restore confidence. When Robert McNeil talked to the Vice President at the weekend, he asked him the signs for a fresh start.
Well, I was nominated by the President October 12th. I think since that date, just using that as a benchmark, there has been a great deal done. The President has undertaken and I think carried out quite successfully, despite some critics in the news media, Operation Candor. He laid out his full financial records, including his income tax returns. He has answered, I think, to a very substantial degree some of the comments concerning his involvement in the ITT matter and in the milk fund contributions.
Well, do you think all this has been effective? And if so, how do you explain the latest Gallup poll at the end of the year, which still puts the president's popularity at 29%, almost its lowest point?
There's been a very slight increase, but you can put it this way, the slide downward has stopped. and I think the corner has been turned. It's my judgment that as we hopefully move toward a settlement in the Middle East, where I think Dr. Kissinger and the President have done an excellent job of at least getting the negotiations started, and with some prospect of a settlement in one aspect of the controversy over there, I think the President's popularity will move up, because the American people want progress in this very volatile area of the world, and if progress takes place, this administration under President Nixon and Henry Kissinger can claim some, I think, some credit for it.
You believe that the erosion due to Watergate has stopped, in fact?
That's my judgment.
You've said a number of times that you did not think there were grounds for impeachment of the President. You've also promised that you would do everything possible yourself to prevent impeachment. Of course, if he were successfully impeached, you would become President. What can you do to prevent impeachment yourself?
Let me reiterate, in my own words, my attitude. I don't think there is any evidence whatsoever as of this date that would justify an impeachment resolution out of the House Committee on the Judiciary, nor an affirmative vote in the House of Representatives on such a resolution. No evidence today that fits within the definition of an impeachable action under our Constitution. The language for the impeachment of a president in our Constitution is treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
But you yourself, Mr. Ford, are famous for having said that grounds for impeachment are whatever a majority of the House of Representatives thinks at a particular time.
Let me differentiate, if I may. I said that in reference to the prospective or proposed impeachment of a federal judge. Now, under our Constitution, federal judges are appointed during good behavior. And you can impeach a federal judge for misbehavior. I think it's far more difficult for a Congress to impeach and convict a president under the specific definition of what is impeachable for a president than it is for a federal judge.
You said during your confirmation hearings that one of the most important qualifications for the presidency is to be a man who exemplified the moral and ethical standards of the nation. Do you think that Mr. Nixon has done that?
If you look at his total record, the answer is yes. And I think today, putting it figuratively, his 5 years as president, he himself has represented the cross-section of American ethics and morality. Unfortunately, and this happens to anybody who heads a big organization, and our federal government is a big organization, there are regrettably people who disappoint you, who do things that are either unethical or illegal. Tragically, in the Watergate case, some people did wrong things, no question about it. But if you speak of Mr. Nixon's personal ethics, his personal morality, I think he represents cross-section America.
You have virtually the same political philosophy as Mr. Nixon, and yet you have had, over your 25 years in public life, very good relations with the press. Mr. Nixon's tended to have not so good relations with the press. Now, does that argue that maybe there is not a liberal conspiracy, or how do you explain it?
I think it's a matter of personality, lifestyle. I think I'm perhaps more gregarious, a friendlier person, less shy than Mr. Nixon. Although knowing him as I have for 25 years, when you get to know him as I do, he is not a shy person. He is very enjoyable to be with in private company. But in public, at least, he's reserved. my lifestyle is quite the opposite, and I think that has an impact on our relations with the press. I'm less suspicious, I suspect, of people than Mr. Nixon. Maybe that's bad in some cases, but at least it helps in your relations with the press.
What is he like to be with right now? Looking at it from the outside, one sees a rather drawn face, and he has been under extraordinary pressure this last 9 months, and you find yourself wondering, how can a man stand that? Why doesn't he crack up? Now, you've known him for this long time. How is he different now, and what's he like to be with?
Let me say at the outset, I've seen him a great deal in the last several months. He's in good health mentally and physically. I think he's bearing up extremely well under the circumstances of all this pressure. He's strong, he's tough, I think he's extremely able. And those people who think by hitting him and beating him through the news media or through any other way are dealing with one of the most resolute, one of the stoutest people I've ever known in my lifetime.
What percentage chance would you give the president of completing the rest of his term?
100%.
What will happen to the Republican Party in the congressional elections next November if this Watergate business and all the processes through the courts have dragged on for months?
In the 1974 elections, the American people, in my opinion, will be more interested in whether we have peace, whether we have a healthy economy, whether we have solved the energy problem, than they will be in a Watergate atmosphere. I happen to believe we're going to have peace. I think you're going to see a reasonably healthy economy. Therefore, in 1974, I don't think you're going to see any significant swing of the pendulum politically.
Turning to the energy crisis, Mr. Vice President, what is the purpose of the conference that the President has called for next month?
I think it's a step in trying to get consumer nations and eventually producing nations together to work in concert with one another in order to get the maximum benefit out of what resources we have. It seems to him, and certainly to me, that the last thing we want is a world economic crisis, a world economic depression comparable, for example, to that which took place in the 1930s. And unless all of us as consumers or producers recognize that we have a mutual interest, if each one of us does our thing for our own selfish benefit, then I think a series of events could take place that would have absolutely catastrophic economic consequences to the world.
So your government thinks there are dangers in countries like, for instance, Britain and France, scrambling off after their own private deals with the Arabs?
I think that's the feeling of this administration and the American people. I think we understand it, but the total society we have today, the industrial, commercial society we have on a global basis, ought to convince everybody that if we work together, we'll all survive. But if we go off each in one's own way, then on a temporary basis, the one country or several countries could be the beneficiaries. But in the long run, it'll be to the detriment of the globe as a whole.
One hears oil executives saying in private, and increasingly nowadays, that it might come to the point when the West might have to use military force to get its oil, that the Sixth Fleet might have to be sent in. Is that a preposterous idea?
I think it is. I know of no responsible American leader who is saying that the military force would be utilized to obtain oil from the Middle East. I think that is preposterous. I would strongly oppose it. I think we have other methods of taking care of our military capability, and our domestic economy. We may have to tighten our belt, as people in Britain are doing today. We may have to tighten that belt seriously. But I see no reason, no justification at all for any military force to obtain oil from the Middle East.
That was Vice President Ford on the world economic situation. We understand that Mr. Whitelaw has now come out from number 10 Downing Street and the talks there and has made a statement. So let's go over again to 10 Downing Street.
Do you see this finally as the end of the road in these particular negotiations and perhaps the beginning of an election, atmosphere at least, or is there something further to happen?
I think you first of all talk about them as negotiations. They aren't in effect negotiations in themselves. There are other people who are engaged in negotiations. These are, of course, discussions on the particular formula put forward by the TUC. All I would say is that everyone wants to find a way out of the present industrial difficulties. Everyone wants to see the end of the 3-day working week. That is what we are trying to do. In my mind, there are no other considerations.
And that is all from Panorama tonight. From us all, good night.